I think folks who paid a lot of attention to feature releases during that time will be
Yep.
happy to hear
Yeah.
that. Yeah, if
So I
it's
think what you're going to see, Zach, is you're going to see a nice investment in the core PCB functionality, and you're going to see us make a lot of noise around it. And that was our hallmark. And I think that was really, frankly, a great example of user centricity manifested.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Altium OnTrack Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Peterson. Today, we're talking with Lawrence Romine, Senior Director of Marketing at Altium. We've had Lawrence on the show several times in the past, and last time I talked to him was at PCB West in 2025. Very happy to have him back on the show today. Lawrence, great to have you back.
It's always great to be here, Zach. Thanks for having me.
Perfect time for you to be showing up on the podcast. I get a lot of questions about, what's going on at Altium and the Altium product offerings. I think a lot of people have some strong opinions, a lot of questions, and you are the guy, at least in my opinion, to help clear all that stuff up. So I think it's a great time for you to be on the show. Last time when we had talked at PCB West in 2025, there's something that struck out at me that you had said, and that was that Altium was coming back home to the designer and refocusing on the user. And I thought that was pretty telling that you would say that, because I always felt that we kind of focused on the user at Altium, and I always try to focus on the user. I get to interact with a lot of designers, so it was really telling to hear you say that. And I think for us to kind of get started in this conversation is just tell us what you mean by that and how Altium has really been pursuing that vision.
Yeah, sure. So, Altium is a really, it's a cool story, quite frankly. We started in the mecca of electronics, Tasmania, Australia. Obviously, it was a joke. But that is true. So the company was founded by an individual at a Hobart, Tasmania, Australia, and he was a student actually at the time that was doing design work on the side. And in those days, think early '80s, you really only had tape and Mylar, which you're probably too young to have ever even seen. Or if you had big, deep pockets, you could go with these sort of newfangled devices. I think one was called like a daisy machine, but there was some automation available. But it was really off limits to the majority of designers. And right at this time, the personal computer was being cloned, and computing power via Moore's Law was becoming more ubiquitous and available. And long story short, he wrote a little piece of software to run on a personal computer, but just for his own use, to support his own efforts in designing circuit boards for his consulting customers. And pretty quickly, I think his customers saw what he was doing and said, "Well, hey, mate, there's your product. That's your business." And the rest is history. And 40 years later, here we are under a slightly different name. But the point being is the company was founded with the user at the center of it. And because we were really on the outside looking in, we really didn't have access to the enterprise customers, if you will. And even 20 years post-founding, I can tell you when I started here, and I've made this joke for many years, and I think I even maybe said this to you last time we spoke at PCB West, which was, I would call customers and they didn't know the name Altium, and they thought I was literally trying to sell them a Nissan Altima.
I do remember you saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I say that because, it's true. People did say that. And look, I was hired into the organization in 2005 as a pedigreed salesperson that wore a suit and a tie to work every day. And pretty quickly I realized that, and by the way, my charter was to get deeper and wider into our customers' organizations, get to the decision makers. And it was pretty obvious pretty quickly that they weren't taking my calls, Zach. And that left us really with the user community, as those people would take our calls and come to find out, well, what do you know? They have decision-making power as well. And this became very powerful for us really after 2008 financial crisis, and also that coincided with the rise of the Internet of Things. And really the focus moved in these product development companies away from executives controlling cost to really speed. We need to do something fast. We need to develop these products quickly, else we'll be beat to market by our competitors. And when they went to talk to the engineering users, basically they said, well, if you want us to do something quick, well, we would like to use Altium Designer. And that led us really to be top dog in the business. Like we definitely became the industry standard in printed circuit board design. And that was on the back of engineers choosing to use Altium Designer. And in many cases, Zach, believe it or not, we even had presence in organizations that weren't allowed to use Altium Designer. And I've told this story before. I won't mention the name of the company, although they're no longer around. But at the time, they were significant, thousands of engineers developing cell phones. And in any case, they were a customer of mine personally. They had 3 or 4 or 5 licenses of Altium Designer. This was sort of 2006, 2007 timeframe. And I was on the phone with them, and I said, look, I'm a sales guy. I'd be remiss if I said, look, you got thousands of engineers. How do I get more footprint there at your organization? And he said, look, we got a master software agreement with Mentor at the time, and I'm not technically allowed to use your products. I'm not even allowed to talk to you. I said, well, how are you justifying the 4 or 5 licenses you have now? And he said, oh, that's simple. We keep Altium Designer around when we need to do something fast. I mean, obviously, Zach, you see the sort of irony of it, right? Which is, don't you want to do everything fast? And in those days, they didn't. It was really about how can we control the design process to control costs and get our designers to adhere to our design process, approve vendor list, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, our product was really tuned for the designer first. And engineers recognized that, saw that. We had a history of first on the back of unified design, 3D PCB design, et cetera. And we just elevated to the top of the industry. So that's the sort of background of how we arrived at the sort of, industry standard. But that's where the story sort of pivots, right? Which is those individual designers, which we won the hearts and minds through, producing a product and marketing a product that they wanted to use, and selling it directly to them. This naturally evolved into becoming teams of engineers. And those teams, some of them naturally evolved into becoming enterprises. And today, some of our largest customers, which again, I won't mention any names, but they're household names and have hundreds of our licenses in their organizations. Every single one of them, I remember distinctly the first license we sold them at a discount and to an individual engineer. And they became household names over time. And so what naturally happened is selling a single product, our customers really became, as we were, thousands and thousands of users, which we still have. But then all of a sudden we had smaller numbers of enterprises that were spending lots of money with us that had mandates, if you will, maybe a strong word, but the needs, wants, and desires that they needed from our product began to diverge from those of the users. And so we had to develop features for those customers. And if we're selling a single product, something's got to give, right? And so just naturally, we gravitated more towards those enterprises. And so when I say that we're returning to, it's a homecoming for us, is this multiple solution offering that we have allows us to return focus to those individual users, and do that across the board, right? So whether you're an individual user, you still get the same fantastic Altium Designer design first experience, or whether you're a designer as part of a team or a designer that's part of a significantly large enterprise, you're getting the same great classic, if you will, Altium Designer user experience that you know and love. But as you go up, we begin to add the capabilities that organizations and enterprises that they actually need. So the beauty of it is the individual user, you're not paying for stuff that you don't need, but you're getting all the stuff that you want.
Sure. And I think that makes sense when you look at it from the perspective of trying to serve a greater enterprise customer base. I think what you left out there, and I was talking about this with Chris Gamble on the Amp Hour podcast a few months ago. But I think what you left out there is when the real push towards enterprise happened, because it was right around COVID, and it was right around that time that everybody went remote, and I think the enterprises needed those additional tools in order to be able to manage everything that was happening in their organizations and continue to do business, as it were, even though they probably had to send half or all of their engineering staff home.
That's a great point, actually, Zach, because we had been developing Altium 365, which is the platform that you're referring to, for quite some time. Obviously, we didn't just develop it overnight and then release it. But when we went home for COVID, obviously, I think we all remember where we were. It was one of those classic events, right? When we got the news that, hey, we're all going home. But from memory, it was March-ish of 2020. And within a few days, I got a call from the CEO here and said, we're going to launch Altium 365. And we did. Within a week, we had full marketing campaigns. We had updated the websites and product SKUs, et cetera. And we began to market heavily and sell Altium 365. And to your point, it was just right at the perfect time. Like, people needed it right then and there. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think if you're kind of maybe an individual designer, contract designer, small company kind of looking in, I think it's understandable seeing what the pivot was and kind of wondering, hey, have we been left behind here? And so I kind of get now your message about coming back home to the individual designer.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and look, that's the interesting thing. And so, look, we covered the sort of why of it. Like, why is Altium, after 40 years of single product offering, one size fits most approach to the market, why are we now all of a sudden introducing multiple solutions to the market? And maybe, Zach, maybe that's a good segue into sort of what are the offerings? Because that is really what I see. And again, you're really eyes and ears on the ground, but from my, I wouldn't say ivory tower, but I'd say from my 7th floor office here in San Diego, California, what I see is that's the biggest confusion, is really not just the what of it, like what are these products, but who are they for?
Well, so that brings us to the most recent packaging of the Altium product line, and I get asked most often about Develop. So that's the first product offering, is Altium Develop, but then there's also Altium Agile and then Altium Enterprise. So those are the three product offerings, or I guess you could say packagings or rebrandings, whatever word you want to use. But those are the three packages. So do us a favor, tell us, who are these for, what's included in each, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so it's worth probably mentioning that they're all three product offerings. So we have Develop, Teams, and Enterprise, as you said. All three of those solutions are different packaging of Altium Designer that you know and love, and Altium 365. And depending on which solution that you slot into or subscribe to, you get certain feature access and capability rights, if you will, on the platform. From an Altium Designer perspective, effectively the same. There's some subtlety differences when you go from Develop into Teams and Agile, but almost not worth writing home about from a pure printed circuit board design perspective. Effectively, same Altium Designer experience that you know and love. The distinction really comes in how you would use the products. And so the way I like to describe it is there's a spectrum. On the Develop side of the spectrum, really, it's PCB-centric proposition. And as you move on the x-axis towards enterprise, you're moving away from PCB being the centerpiece of what you do. Often it's an individual that does all of the above. They source their own components. They do their own manufacturing, engineering, if you will. They're really doing all of it. They're the chief bottle washer and executive, etc. But as you move on the spectrum from that into design collaboration, where you potentially have teams of people working on these things. So the way I like a good example of this is on the develop side. Oftentimes you have the electrical engineer and the mechanical engineer. It's one guy or gal, as it were. Whereas as you move into more teams, then you would have electrical engineering people and you would have mechanical engineering people. And that's what I call collaboration. And then as you move into the enterprise world, that really moves towards what I call governance. So this is really, think really applications, medical industry, aerospace industry, where you're really trying to control the workspace, the workflow. So kind of you call it on the develop side, and as you move to enterprise, it becomes more governed.
Yeah, I think it's easy to understand the extreme ends, right? Like Altium Develop is still the same Altium Designer that everybody knows. Plus, you get some of the standard basic cloud features, workspace and all of that. On the enterprise side, now you have a system where your company, your IT manager can control who gets access to what, where are the projects stored, all those kinds of things that are really important for large organizations. And then it all integrates into Altium Designer. And I've worked with some companies that, use Altium Enterprise. And I mean, it really is pretty seamless, especially with like license management and that kind of stuff. And then there's this thing in the middle, which is Teams. So I'm really interested if you could dig in just a little bit more into what is in Agile Teams and what does kind of that scaling look like from, maybe one or two designers at a contract firm all the way up to, an enterprise with 200 licenses.
Sure. Yeah. And I would say this, the distinct difference between the Teams and the Agile offering is really going to be around out of the box versus tailored to your environment. That's really the distinct difference. That truly is the distinct difference.
Okay, so some of the things I just mentioned with enterprise, you can do in Agile. It's just like a pre-configured solution. It runs in the cloud.
That's correct. That's right.
Whereas like with enterprise, they might be deploying it, just again, as an example that I typically see, on-premises server behind a VPN. There's all these access controls.
Right, and perhaps you customize the approval process as an example to suit your particular environment. And again, that's where we see customers that are in again, I won't mention customer names, but you could imagine customers in the automotive space building cars. Obviously, that's heavily regulated and governed. And likewise, customers that do medical devices, obviously that has to be heavily regulated and governed. And also aerospace. So think safety critical applications, those sorts of things.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I kind of see, I think, a bit better where Altium Agile fits in. It's really kind of that intermediate point between, hey, we have 10 engineers versus adding another 0. Now we have 100 engineers and to take greater control over all our processes.
Yeah, and look, I also am a little hesitant to put a lot of focus on number of engineers.
Sure.
Frankly, to me, it really comes down to how you need to use and implement the solution. And when I say homecoming, that Altium Develop offering is really the classic where we were in 2015, where we were, really coming on strong as the industry standard in printed circuit board design. The engineers loved it because it didn't get in the way of their creativity. It really allowed them to stay in flow. But we did offer some really great stuff, particularly when we first brought in Altium 365, some great stuff that enhanced what they were already doing versus sort of forcing them to do something different, right? So the way I like to describe it is it's well, you're already sharing your designs. This is just a better way of sharing your designs. You're already saving your designs. Well, geez, wouldn't it be nice if you just saved your designs as you already were? But you got version history just built in as you went along. And that's where I say it's sort of frictionless. I hate to use the word collaboration because, a lot of guys and gals like you, Zach, I work alone. But you really don't.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't, because collaboration feels heavy.
It feels a little buzzwordy too, right?
Yeah, and it feels a little forced, right?
Yeah.
And, and I like to, this industry, at the design level, a lot of these guys and gals are kind of renegades. And by the way, I love that about this industry. I love that about our customers. And that's what Altium Develop really allows you to do. Look, you use it as you see fit. None of this is forced. You can save your designs locally if that's the way you choose to do it. Or if you choose to use the cloud platform, Altium 365, you can do that as well. Now, there's, again, upside in doing so, but we're not forcing you to do it. That's also, by the way, a big misconception. If you don't want to use the cloud stuff, you don't need to use it. When you get into the team stuff, that capability, a lot of the capability that is advertised and that companies would buy into, well, that's going to be cloud-based. And if you want to take advantage of it, then you need to use the cloud offering.
Sure.
Develop is a much more you choose it proposition.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. Now that you kind of are describing this, I almost envision one of those like pricing bar pages that you see on like a SaaS website where they kind of compare them side by side and you see the progression in adding more and more features. And that's kind of a good way to think of it. But at the core is still Altium Designer. It's not like an actual different product.
Well, and that's just look. So our traditional customer base, engineers, PCB designers, this is not a good, better, best proposition, which is what you're referring to in the business, Zach, as we say. Packaging, they would say you have a good, better, and best. And as I said, that is not at all what we're proposing here from a PCB design perspective. And it has much more to do with who you are and how you would need to use the solution. And not to be too redundant here, but on the develop world, are you a board-centric individual that is really much more about coordinating the design effort, and you have no more than 5 users? Again, not that I want to put a focus on volume, if you will, but the develop world, we do have a limit of 5 licenses per account. Then you're a develop customer. As you move into collaboration amongst teams of individuals, then as the name implies, you're teams. And then if you need to customize that and you have very specific integration needs for your organization or your enterprise, then you're in the enterprise domain.
This is all, I think, very helpful for folks out there who are listening. So now the magic question, right? What has been the user response to all of this new branding or packaging, whatever word you want to use?
So that's an interesting question, Zach, right? So I monitor the social forums.
As do I.
Yeah, weekly. And I do it in an automated way as well. And so I've been able to see the arc. And I'd just be transparent. So, and to a large degree, I don't think we should be surprised by any of this. As I said, we were a single product company effectively for 40 years. And then so I don't know why we would be surprised when we introduce new products that people sort of clutch their pearls a little bit and go, right? And also the human nature is, what does this mean for me? Right? And it takes time to get your message out. And also when you got salespeople involved, you have marketing pages involved, you have an affiliates involved, et cetera, getting them all to sing from the same sheet of music also takes a little bit of time. So I would say the initial response was confusion. That confusion now is definitely subsiding and people are now beginning to understand it. And then once customers fully understand it, they actually typically perceive it as good news, because the real key here is that you're not paying for capability that you were never going to use. And that's
Sure.
that's that homecoming. I'm speaking, look, I'm responsible for Develop, so I'm speaking specifically for the Develop cohort of customers. They felt left behind. And once it's fully understood, they feel like, oh, this is actually fantastic news. This is actually fantastic news.
And you mentioned pearl clutching. I think the initial response is, oh, does this mean I have to buy another product to do what I was already doing? Or does
No.
this mean I lose access to some feature? I think that's a natural kind of
Yeah.
response when you see that suddenly your favorite design program just got a new name, right? Or that's what you
Sure.
perceive it as.
Yeah. So look, on the Develop side, this is the way I would describe the feature set. So it's basically standards. If you're familiar with what our standard subscription offered from a Altium Designer feature standpoint, it has all that stuff. Plus, we added multi-board and harness design. So it's much more analogous to what we were offering in the pro level subscription. But then we eliminated some of the more company-centric things. So think single sign-on as an example.
Right.
Like, for example, Zach, your company, as a service bureau, you don't need single sign-on. So why would you pay the commiserate price for single sign-on? License
that's
pool
fair.
management. Yeah.
But the enterprise customers that you guys have that maybe I might collaborate with, they absolutely need single sign-on.
For sure they do. Absolutely. License pool management. Right. That's something that was not included in Altium Develop as an example. Lifecycle management, not included in Altium Develop. So, you can't please everybody, but for the most part, when explained, most customers, again, traditional customers that were that fit that Develop cohort go, well, this is fantastic news, particularly once you hear the price. So the price is, for the first subscription, $19.95 a year, and then every additional up to 5 is $9.95. So it's a significant discount over effectively the same functionality that these customers actually cared about. It's effectively half price.
Yeah, I still see criticisms of Altium based on price, but my response is twofold to that. First of all, are you trying to quote me the price from like 5 years ago when it was, a 3-year subscription batch or something like that? Or, I'll just tell them, well, go compare to, Expedition, right? Or go compare to Cadence and then tell me it's actually expensive. And then, when you get that message across, people say, okay, I get what you're saying.
Money is an emotional thing. It is. But I also think we need to not confuse price and value. Sure. And that's effectively what you're saying, Zach, right? Which is, for this price, it's a hell of a lot of value, in my opinion. And if you just, from a benchmarking perspective, compared to what we previously were selling, and again, for my cohort of customers, the profile that I'm pursuing with Altium Develop, you're getting everything you were getting previously, plus a little more, actually, when you consider multi-board and harness design also included, for about half the price is what we were charging before we made the change. So, as I said, I guess that's a long way around the block to answer your original question, which is, how are customers reacting to it? Once they understand that, they go, well, this is pretty good. And if you're already a subscriber, effectively, you can just transition seamlessly to Altium Develop. And when your current contract ends, your new contract starts, and you pay less.
Another thing that often comes up when I talk to folks in the field with my ear on the ground, as you said, you have these 3 new focus areas, but the regular Altium Designer user is, I think, often expecting, new features, right? And so when you have these 3 focus areas, right, you have 3 different, let's say, cohorts or user groups that you're focusing on. So how does Altium go about prioritizing, new feature development, or if they're going to do something like with Valley Space, where it then becomes incorporated as requirements management, right? Maybe that's kind of the route that we go to get a new feature in. How does Altium going about prioritizing new feature development to align with these different user groups?
So that's an interesting question. And what I would say is probably not to look at it from the perspective of solution to solution. In other words, not to say, how are we prioritizing development of enterprise or teams or develop? Because again, foundationally, they're the same products, right? So I would instead look at it more along the lines of, how do we prioritize the development of Altium Designer and the development of Altium 365? And then enterprise is another animal as well. From a PCB design perspective, well, that comes from the user community. And that would be from forums like this sounds redundant, our forums. Obviously, we have product management that monitors the social sphere, as it were. We have a beta group, etc. So Altium Designer, nothing changes. And same thing from Altium 365.
As far as focusing on some of those, potential new, let's say, new offerings or new features for new designers, this, I think, echoes the story of coming back home to the user.
Let me address the elephant in the room, Zach.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the frustration is that I think what our traditional user base has felt is that as more and more of our revenue was coming from enterprise customers, I think they felt less and less heard.
Sure.
I think that's fair, right? I mean, I just don't see any reason to beat around the bush here. Let's just be direct. And this pivot does allow us to allocate our internal resources accordingly. And I can say, and I don't have the details yet, but there is a new release of Altium Designer that is scheduled that we're talking about internally. And what I will say to you is that launch should look much more familiar to what we were doing in the 2015 to 2020 timeframe than it did post.
I think folks who paid a lot of attention to feature releases during that time will be happy to hear that. Yeah.
So I think what you're going to see, Zach, is you're going to see a nice investment in the core PCB functionality, and you're going to see us make a lot of noise around it. And that was our hallmark. And I think that was really, frankly, a great example of user-centricity manifested. We made huge noise every year, 15, 16, 17, 18. Those were the salad days, if you will, if you were a printed circuit board designer using Altium Designer, because every year we did a huge splash release. We marketed the heck out of it, made a big deal out of it. And what you should see coming is something that looks more like that than what you've seen since 2020.
Well, it's definitely going to give the competition a run for its money. I'm sure if we're going back to that kind of feature release cadence. So I'm excited to see it.
Yeah. And look, let's just be direct as well. And now I'm being redundant saying direct, but let's be transparent. And if you go look at any of our updates to the market, this was our business strategy. Was we were going to be very focused on printed circuit board. We were going to be heavily focused on winning the hearts and minds of engineers and printed circuit board designers worldwide. And we were going to back that with a regular cadence of releases. And that's what we delivered. And it frankly worked very, very well. But as I said, almost too well, right? Because that led to those users became teams, those teams became enterprises, and then subsequently we had to focus accordingly.
Well, I see these as growing pains of a successful organization because you had to how do you split your focus between kind of the budding new users and then, like you said, the existing user base that has grown to have more needs to be able to be more efficient and do things with teams and all of this. And I think you get pulled in a lot of different directions. So yeah, these, the way you explained it to me, these growing pains make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, these are, as I say, these are luxury problems, Zach. right?
Very first world PCB design software company problems.
Yeah, for sure. But these are good. Look, another way of saying it, these are good problems to have. But for our success, we wouldn't be struggling. And I guess I would say, and I've said this for years, we would not have had that success if it wasn't for the designers themselves choosing to use Altium Designer. And they only get frustrated because they are so emotionally invested in not just the products, but frankly, the success of our company. Sure. And so that's when I say it's a homecoming and we're returning to our roots. That's what I'm getting at, is we need to take care of those people because, look, let's face it, that cycle's not going to go away either, right? Those users, we need to get the next batch of users that become the teams and those teams becoming the enterprises. It's a successful winning strategy. But what we can't do is be successful in one of those cohorts at the expense of the other. And that's what this new strategy allows us to do, is put specific focus into each of those groups and package and price an offering specifically for them.
I think that's a great note to end on. And I'm excited to see some of the new releases that you've hinted at. And I think a lot of the users out there will be very excited as well. Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really cool talk, and I am excited to see what the company's going to put out in the coming years.
Thank you, Zach. It's always a pleasure, my friend.
To everyone that's out there listening, we've been talking with Lawrence Romine, Senior Director of Marketing at Altium. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. You'll be able to keep up with all of our podcast episodes and tutorials as they come out. And last but not least, don't stop learning, stay on track, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.